For those of you who don't know me, my name is Mike Madison. I'm the planning director for Williamson County. To my left is Greg Dale. Greg is with McBride Dale Clarion, and Greg is the lead consultant on this project, which entails updating the county's comprehensive land use plan. We think that this is a very, very important project. It's always important when we're updating a comprehensive plan. It's particularly important, though, in light of the development and growth that we've been experiencing and are forecasted to experience in the future. We feel like this is a real crucial time in the life of the county, and your participation, your attendance tonight, and the comments that we receive from you will go a long way toward helping to shape what the future of Williamson County looks like. So we're grateful for you being here. Really, there are two main purposes for this meeting, the first of which is to provide you with information regarding the project in general, but then in particular regarding a couple of different growth scenarios that we'd like you to think about and consider. And then secondly, and most importantly, the other objective is to hear from you and get your feedback regarding those scenarios. So in a minute, Greg is going to walk you through the information, and then after he finishes his presentation, he'll walk you through how you all can provide your comments tonight and even going forward. So thank you for coming. With that, I'll turn it over to Greg.
Great, thank you, Mike. Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming out tonight. As Mike said, we are going to be presenting some information to you, but then also allowing you to kind of process that information and talk a little bit. So what we're going to try to do here on the agenda is to just, first of all, update you all on where we are in the planning process. How many of you were at the meeting in spring? I think it was April. Louder? Okay, good, thank you. So a lot of you were. So what I'm going to try to do tonight is do a little bit of a refresher. I'm going to try not to repeat too much, but for those of you who weren't there, it's probably worth hearing some refresher on that and to remind you of some of the numbers that we're talking about, some of the information that we're talking about. And then, as Mike said, we're going to try to present some what we call scenarios, and I'll explain what those are, but those are really just us trying to think about how things could unfold in the future in terms of growth and development in Williamson County under different scenarios. And we'll explain, hopefully you will be able to take what all of that means. And then we really need to process this. So we really are, you'll hear me use the term a couple of times tonight, you really are at a fork in the road in terms of your future here. You have some choices to make as a community, and we're going to try to identify, at least in some simple terms, what a couple of those choices are and what some of the implications of those are, and then hopefully we get your input on that tonight. So here's the basic process that we've been involved in. I won't bore you with all of the process kind of stuff, but you know, we're actually, this makes it look like we're in the middle of the process. We're really chronologically much further along, because after tonight and then after tomorrow, when we meet with an advisory committee which has been established to help guide this process, we hope to be making some choices, and then we'll be moving into drafting the plan and presenting that back to the community. And we've lost a little bit of ground in terms of some of the analysis that we've been doing. I'll explain to you, but you know, we hope to be able to wrap this up still by the end of the year. So this is the refresher part. So a couple of things. There's a lot of information on this slide, but this is really almost like the whole last meeting in a shorthand version of this. So you will recall, you know, most of you know, you have a comprehensive land use plan now. It was updated in about 2007, so about 10 plus years old. One of the things that we did early in the process was to do what we call an assessment of that, exactly what it sounds like. We look at what that plan said you wanted to do and all the things that that plan set out as kind of the to-do list, what planners call the implementation strategy, and looked at how well the county has done in implementing that plan. And it was a mixed review, as you might expect. There were a lot of things that have been accomplished: the zoning code update, the area plans, and updates to the zoning around those villages. But I'm not going to repeat all that. But the bottom line is what we did conclude, that is, in terms of this big, broad growth management effort in the county, that's falling short. So the short version of that, which you'll hear me talk about, but just to give you the background, is the idea in the current plan is that as much as possible, new growth and development should be guided to areas around where the development is already occurring, as opposed to being spread out throughout the county. There are very strong policies in the current plan of trying to preserve the rural character outside of the cities. And again, looking at that, that's had mixed results. So that concept of rural preservation and encouraging growth to occur in and around, you'll hear the term urban growth boundaries, or UGBs. That's a term we're going to be using tonight. Those are the areas that have been identified around the cities where growth is intended to be guided to. You've all no doubt heard the term sprawl, right? That's a popular term that a lot of people talk about. What's supposed to be happening here under your current plan is the opposite of sprawl, right? It's supposed to be more rural preservation and growth occurring in and around existing areas. And then there are a series of related issues associated with that, things like how our sewer service is applied, whether it's public sanitary sewer or septic systems or alternative systems, which are enabling a lot of the development in the rural areas. Road planning and funding, open space planning, the conservation subdivisions, historic preservation. Those are all things that are kind of part of the stew of different growth issues. But one of the things that is clear, and that brings us to what we're going to be talking about tonight, is the underlying density. In other words, how much growth can occur in the rural areas. That's kind of the common thread that runs throughout this. And so what we set out to do with these scenarios is play the what if game. What if we change some of those underlying assumptions? What if we continue to be on the track that we're currently on? What do we have? That's what we're going to be talking about here tonight. This is just a map that we showed at the last meeting, which I think illustrates the point. So, and this is helpful to understand the geography that we're talking about. So everything that's in the gray are the existing cities: Franklin, Brentwood, Nolensville, Thompson Station, Spring Hill, and Fairview. Everything that's in the yellow, if you can see those yellow areas, those are the urban growth boundaries. Those are the areas that were identified as essentially the city's growth areas, the expansion areas. And then everything, everything in white out here is unincorporated county outside the growth boundaries. If you look at the red was the development that existed in about 2007 when the last plan was done, and the purple and blue are development, either residential development or subdivisions that haven't quite been completed yet, that have occurred since 2007. So if the system was working the way we want it to work, which is growth in and around those urban growth boundaries, you would see much more of this purple and blue happening in these yellow areas. Does that make sense? But that's not what's been happening, right? So that's why we're here tonight. So that's kind of to set the stage for the discussion. Another background piece of information, this is population growth existing, historic, all the way back to 1900 up to right about there where we are, right around there today, at a little over, by now that's 2017, a little over 226,000 people in the county. This is county-wide, this is including the cities. We'll be breaking that out here in just a minute, but this is including the cities. And this is the growth forecast to the year 2040. You're at about 226 now. You would be adding under this another 300,000+ people, and you are projected or forecasted to be at over 500,000 within the next 20 years. Now, a lot of people have looked at these numbers and have been pretty stunned by them. These are tremendous growth pressures, but these are numbers that have been used at the regional level in terms of transportation planning. They've been used, they're in the Williamson County Trends Report. So my point is, these are not numbers that we've made up. These are numbers that are out there that people are relying upon. And that is that the idea within the next 20 years, you're going to more than double your population in Williamson County overall. That's the forecast. So that's why we're here, and that's why I make the point that we're at the fork in the road, right? So here's the question before us tonight and in this process. Does the county still want to preserve rural character in outlying areas by focusing the majority of the growth in and around the municipalities, in and around the cities? That's your current policy. It's not really been happening as well as you would like it to, but that's your policy. Or do we stay with business as usual? Continue the suburban development sprawling into rural areas, particularly in the east, if that is determined ultimately in this process to be the path that the community takes, then that has certain ramifications. So either way, that growth is, we have to assume that that growth that's forecasted is coming, and it's a question of which path we take. So that's the question that we're framing up for us tonight. I do think that is you as a community are at a now or never proposition with this because of the growth pressures that you face, and that's why we're here tonight. Okay, so a couple of things. When we looked at the scenarios that you're going to be seeing, one of the things is, I just want to be clear on, we heard you all loud and clear at the meeting in April, and that is, at least the people in that room clearly wanted to preserve rural character, that fork in the road, they wanted to preserve rural character. There's obvious concern about traffic impacts of growth. That's, you know, one of the key quality of life indicators in community. It doesn't take a planner to drive around and tell you that you have traffic congestion issues. Concern about the loss of open space, community preferences for character, and that rural character. So that's really kind of helped guide us. We heard that. Okay. So I'm not going to bore you with all of this. I'm just trying to kind of impress you with how sophisticated this growth management strategy or this scenario process is. And it's taken more time than we want, but this is not SimCity. This is real world kind of thing. So there was an extensive process of identifying available land, doing assumptions, you know, working with planning staff. We've gone through multiple different iterations of these. We looked at a lot of different scenarios. We're going to talk about two scenarios in particular, but it's really gone through this whole process. So I will kind of jump in. The one thing I want to caution, see it says caution right there, and it's got that big thing right there, is what we're going to be talking about here tonight is not the plan, right? It's looking at two alternative futures. It's going to be looking at business as usual, and it's going to be looking at a variation of that, just to see what that future might look like. Once you decide as a community which path to take in that fork in the road, then that sets a whole series of other things in process, and we get into the true development of the plan. So I just want you to understand that what you're going to be seeing here tonight is not the plan. Okay, so here's why we're here. Two scenarios, we're calling them business as usual and town and country. Business as usual is just what it sounds like. We don't change anything in terms of existing zoning. We just continue to take that population chart that you saw and continue to accommodate the growth under our current zoning. Just so you know, you probably are aware of this, in the unincorporated county, in rough terms, you have two different kinds of zoning. You have zoning that allows 1 unit per acre, or 1 acre lot zoning, and you have zoning that allows 1 unit per 5 acres, okay? Most of the eastern part of the county is 1 unit per acre, but not all of it. There is some land that's zoned 1 unit per 5 acres, but most of it is 1 acre. Most of the land in the western part of the county is 1 unit per 5 acres, but again, there's some land out there that's zoned 1 unit per acre. But generally speaking, when you think about this, generally speaking, you're talking about predominantly 1 acre zoning in the eastern part of the county, 5 acre zoning in the western part of the county. So business as usual just runs the numbers. It just assumes that that's what's happening. In the urban growth boundaries, it assumes it develops as it's currently zoned. In other words, it's a simple concept, very complicated to actually do the analysis, a simple concept of what happens if you build out under your current zoning. And we were also conservative. We removed steep slopes and land that's not suitable for development. We didn't hang houses on hillsides. We did a very conservative estimate of that. I'll show you the results of that here in just a minute. Town and country is this. It's taking all land that's currently zoned 1 unit per acre and assuming what happens if you make it 1 unit per 5 acres, okay? Impacts the eastern side mostly, but a little bit on the western side also. And then in the urban growth boundaries, it assumes that development occurs in those areas at essentially the same kind of densities that are occurring in the cities that it surround. You understand what I'm saying? In other words, you assume in the urban growth boundaries that the development is occurring as it's occurring in those cities, or in some cases according to those city plans, because they've actually done plans for that area, for those areas. We use the term town and country because the idea is, under that scenario, there is an intentional distinction made between rural areas and cities, that there's a distinction there, that there's a distinction between town and country. Okay, so those are the two scenarios. We'll be using some geographies that we can look at, and by the way, when we all finish in here, you're going to see this information outside. You're going to go out there and look at boards. You'd probably notice there are a bunch of boards out there that were turned around so you couldn't see them. But you'll be able to see all of this information and go out and study this in some details. But we did this breakout between the east, and again, just to remind you, those gray areas are the urban growth boundaries, the west and the northwest, so that we'll ultimately be able to show you how those play out geographically. Okay, let's start with existing development. This is just kind of our baseline that we're starting with. So I'm going to show you a series of maps, and again, you're going to see all these maps outside. I'll also, with all of these numbers I show you, I will give you a slide that compares everything, so you don't have to keep track of them and remember them. But under your current existing conditions, you have about 25,000 dwelling units outside the urban growth boundaries. Okay, from now on, we're going to be talking about areas, unincorporated county, outside the urban growth boundaries. You have about 25,000 dwelling units. Average parcel size in those areas, in the rural areas, is about 18 acres, almost 20 acres. You have a trip generation, meaning car trips, automobile trips, of about 1.3 trips per acre per day in the rural areas. And right now, for what it's worth, you have about $140 million deficit in terms of road improvements that are needed in the rural areas to serve the development that you already have. Okay, that's your baseline. Let's look at business as usual. So under business as usual, you have about 82,000 dwelling units in unincorporated county outside the urban growth boundaries. That average parcel size shrinks to about 2 acres per parcel. You now are generating about 6 trips per acre per day in the rural areas, and your deficit, your need in terms of transportation in particular, is about $330 million. But the big number that comes out of this, and this was analysis that was done by one of our sub-consultants, is that the cost to serve that future growth in those unincorporated areas outside the UGBs is about $5 billion. And that's both capital costs, actual physical construction. We're talking about things like roads, schools, libraries, fire, parks, those kinds of facilities. It's about $5 billion. A little more than half of that is actually operating and maintenance costs. So you build something, you have to then maintain it and operate it for 20 years, right? So that's about a $5 billion cost. That's business as usual, or scenario one. And again, I'll put all these numbers back up. Town and country, or scenario two, is, remember, if we change the 1 unit per acre zoning to 1 unit per 5 acre zoning, that's town and country. So now you're looking at about 48,000 dwelling units outside the UGB, average lot size of almost 5 acres per parcel. That $5 billion number drops to $1.5 billion. I'm sorry, I'll show you that in just a second. Your trip generation is reduced to 3.8, and of that 1.5 billion, about 220 million of that is transportation. All right, so, and let me just show you also, I'm going to go backwards. So there's your existing conditions. The other thing I'll point out, you see the red in there? Those are actually red dots, and each one of those dots represents 2 houses, just to give you an idea. So that's what you have now. That's what you look like under scenario one, and under town and country, still a lot of development, but substantially less development. All right, so that's a lot of numbers. Let's let you look at these all in relationship to each other. So business as usual, 82,000 dwelling units outside the UGB versus 48,000 under the town and country. Your average lot size, or average parcel size, 2 acres is more like 4.6 acres. Your $1 billion cost to provide services and facilities to that growth at $5 billion versus $1.5 billion town and country. Your trip generation per acre average is almost in half. And then in transportation alone, you save about $100 million between those two scenarios. Okay, so that's a lot of information. Yeah, we'll take questions here in just a second. That's a lot of information. So I just want you to look at this and process this for a minute, and then I'll open it up for a couple of questions, and then we're going to have some discussions at your tables, and we'll tell you where to go from here. So let me just review that information. Everybody clear on scenario 1 being business as usual, scenario 2 being basically reducing the density in the rural areas to 1 unit per 5 acres in all of the rural areas, and assuming that the urban growth boundaries develop much like the cities that they surround. And then you can see the difference, substantial difference in terms of reduction in dwelling units, reduction in fiscal impact, trip generation, substantially more larger parcel, obviously. But let's be clear, this doesn't stop the growth. I mean, this is how you accommodate the growth, right? So the other thing that you should understand is that these numbers that we're talking about are essentially answering the question, what happens if we build out under our current policies, basically? What happens if we develop under our current policies? And I'll tell you, in a lot of communities, that's kind of an academic exercise. In your community, it's not, because the amount of growth that you're forecasted to have under any of these scenarios effectively accomplishes build out in these under your zoning regulations. See what I'm saying? If you look at how much you can literally accommodate under your current zoning and how much are you forecasted to have, they're actually pretty similar numbers over 20 years. But here's the point. Even if those numbers, those 20-year forecasts are, overly aggressive forecasts, even if you don't have quite that amount of growth, whether you're talking about 20 years or 25 years or 30 years, you still have a tremendous amount of growth coming and a finite capacity to accommodate it. And then those are the scenarios. Okay, that's a lot of information. Does everybody kind of understand the concept of the two scenarios and what they are? Yes, ma'am, all the way in the back.
I have a question with your concept with the, not the rural, the first one.
The business as usual?
Business as usual.
Yes.
Is that business as usual how it was supposed to be or how it actually is?
It's how it's zoned.
But you told us that
Right.
according to the 2007 planning, we didn't follow it.
If
what are we do? Are we going
Right.
to follow the 2007 planning, or are we
Yep.
going to just go willy-nilly wherever we want?
Good question. That's a fair question, and and I'll try to answer it honestly. All good questions. All good questions. If you continue to follow the path of business as usual, you will not accomplish what you set out to accomplish in the 2007 plan. You may as well change the 2007 plan and this plan to say, that's what we're going to do. We're going to continue to stay the track we are, and we're going to have to figure out how to provide all the road improvements and the $5 billion and all that sort of thing. You are not on track to fulfill that. But here's the point. When that zoning plan was put into place, however many decades ago, the basic 1 unit per acre, 1 unit per 5 acres, you didn't have anything like the growth pressures that you have now. I don't think anyone could have imagined at the time that you would be facing what you are facing now. And I said at the last meeting, here's the thing to come to grips with. You are the hot spot and one of the hot regions in the country right now, right? And I know that sounds scary. I always try to keep some perspective on it. That's actually not a bad problem to have in some ways. As I said before, I'd rather live in an area where people want to be than an area where people don't want to be. You have a lot of economic development opportunities. You have a lot of good things that brings. We're really focusing on some of the negative impacts of that. There's no question about that. Mike, did you want to add to that answer?
The only thing I would add is that back 10 or 12 years ago when we updated the comp plan and resulting in our current plan, we had a lot of meetings just like this, and a lot of comments were very, very similar in terms of a desire was expressed to preserve rural character and focus the growth inside the urban growth boundaries, and those policies made their way into the plan. There was even, these same discussions about the potential for reducing densities at that point, but late in that process, back in 2007, a decision was made at that time not to change the fundamental densities that had been in place for many years. And so we have been following the plan with the zoning, but the plan itself, because it didn't recommend changing the densities at that time, didn't result in the actual preservation of rural character like I think a lot of people wanted to at that point.
Other question? Yes, all the way back there.
I have a question regarding your OpEx estimates. Are those over a certain period of time, or are those over, like, are you estimating an additional, on the, let's say the town and country, an additional $220 million in OpEx per year to maintain those roads, or do you have an estimate of what the maintenance would be on the business as usual or the town and country related to the OpEx outlay?
Right. Yeah, so the question, when you say, well, I couldn't quite hear what you're saying. You talk about the operating and maintenance, is that what you're talking about?
The operating expense.
Operating expense, right.
So, yeah, so
Yes.
are the numbers that you've provided, are those over a certain period of time?
Yes.
And if they are, could you please specify that so we could better understand?
Yeah.
Also related to the capital outlay.
Right.
And then regarding regular maintenance year over year, did you all produce any operating expense estimates for year over year?
Yes.
Related to that?
So the question was related to operating expenses for all of these capital facilities. So yes, your first question was how long. It was a 20-year horizon. The cost that you see, the $5 billion, and we can separately provide you with information on how that breaks down. The lion's share of that, won't surprise you, is schools, and then after that it's roads. But we can show you with all that. And yes, the operating and maintenance costs, those are all baked into that estimate. So that assumes a 20-year horizon, and including capital and operating expenses. Okay, here, and then we'll go back there.
So in 20 years, basically what it looks like that scenario showing, in the town and country scenario, a majority of the potential population is going to be pushed more into the incorporated city areas. Correct? If we're talking about a 580,000 population in 20 years, we're only going to, the town and country is planning to absorb a smaller portion of that, pushing most of that population growth into the cities.
More of it, yes.
So,
yes.
in terms of UGB, historically that's kind of been an iron curtain, around the city. But today that's not necessarily the concept. So how does that plan potentially gauge long term when the city's ability to expand beyond the UGB is a little
Right.
more flexible today than it was?
Right. So the question was about the UGB. So first of all, one of the things to understand, yes, under town and country, it assumes that less of that growth and development is occurring in the rural areas and more of that is occurring around the cities. But keep in mind, that's the system you have now, right? The system of UGBs that was originally mandated by state statute some 20 plus years ago, that was exactly the idea. That's the way the system is supposed to work. And that's basically growth management 101. You're better off with growth being accommodated around existing developed areas. It's more efficient to provide with, sewer service. It's more efficient to provide with virtually every public service. If you just imagine houses spread out over 500 square miles versus concentrated in a more focused area, it's just more efficient to serve. There's no question about that. So then I lost track of the second part of your question.
With the city's ability to kind of stretch beyond their current
Right.
boundaries, how does that potentially affect the numbers?
Well, it could. I mean, if the cities, these scenarios assume development occurring within the growth boundaries, the urban growth boundaries as currently constituted. We had to work with something. If cities decide to go beyond those, that could certainly change the numbers. But frankly, what's happening is the opposite, is those urban growth boundaries are not developing at those efficiencies that they were intended to do. In fact, a lot of what's happening is the growth is essentially hopscotching over them because the densities in the rural areas are low enough that it makes it economical to do that. I promise to go in the back room here next.
Yes, sir. Could you give us a little bit, you talked about 18 acres per average dwelling now in the area is not impacted, when only 5 or 1.
Right.
Could you give us a little bit of a flavor as to what's going on within the county as to rezoning presently? Are there no boundaries as to if someone got together and got 3 homeowners at 18 acres each or 50 acres, and they wanted to come in and do 0 lot and build 500 units just to make up a number? Are there some things in place that are keeping us, the county, from doing that, or is it open season?
So the question was that in the unincorporated county, what's keeping people from requesting a rezoning to build denser than what the current zoning allows? That hasn't happened since I've been here for 15 years or so. That has not taken place. And in fact, there are very few zoning districts that we have on the books that would even allow barely more than 1 unit per acre. So that hasn't happened, but frankly, what has happened on a couple of different occasions is that one time in the east, one time in the west, both within about 5 years, groups of property owners who were concerned about development in their area went in together and requested a downzoning. So they requested that their properties be rezoned from 1 unit per acre to 1 unit per 5 acres because they thought it was in their best interest, and they thought that that was a tool to help preserve rural character in those areas. So that has been, much more common in terms of rezoning requests than anything else, really.
Let me say this, and I want to take a few more questions, and then we want to allow you to talk amongst yourself a little bit. But in the meantime, I will point out to you that you see those yellow stickies? This is a pretty low-tech commenting technique that we're going to allow you. You're going to have all these maps that you've seen here are outside on boards. So we're going to ask you to comment on those and to use those stickies in doing it. If you have comments now, I see he's writing right now. If you want to go ahead and start making notes about your comments that you want us to have, feel free to go ahead and start to use those as we're doing questions. So let's take about 5 or 10 more minutes of questions. Who's had their hand up the longest? Come on, in the back. Yes, she's waving.
Yes. So you're talking about 2007, and you're talking about there was a plan. I'm new there, but you're talking about there was a plan.
Yes.
But nobody followed this.
Well, actually, the county did follow the plan. What happened, as Mike said, is the decision was made relatively late in that planning process not to change the 1 unit per acre zoning. And so the current plan it says 1 unit per acre. So the county actually has been following the plan, but as a result, we have this disconnect between the results and what the plan underlying policy stuff says in terms of wanting to preserve rural character. The plan says it wants to preserve rural character, but when the 1 unit per acre zoning wasn't changed back then, and then you pour in all the growth pressures that you've had since then, we have this departure between what the plan says it wants to do and what's actually happening.
So what you're saying then is that even though somebody says something, there are other people that can come in and just go, well, we're not going to do that, so we're just going to do this. So my question here is, I'm not sure what this is all about.
Right.
I mean, we come in, we ask questions, we vote somewhere, how do you stop people? Where do you get really vigilante on this?
Right. So no, fair question. I don't know about the vigilante part, but our job is to facilitate this process and report what we hear from the public, right? And what we've heard from the public so far has been a pretty resounding. We really do want to preserve rural character. So ultimately, the decision is made by the county commissioners, and planning commission and ultimately county commissioners about the zoning. So that's why I say we're at a fork in the road here. This is a decision that the county needs to make, and you are the citizens that are helping to advise that. So maybe this time will be different. So let's go all the way back here, and then here, and then here. Okay. Yes, sir, you. Yeah.
What mechanism, just to follow on some of these questions, what mechanisms are allowed in the county currently to modify base zoning, which I assume is what we're talking about? Do we have SP plans, special plans? Do we have PUDs? Is that how the many larger developments going on in the county, with which I'm certain most folks in here are familiar with, that at least appear on the outside to be developing at greater densities than one home per acre? Are those things that are being done that are modifying this, and how do they fall into this study process?
So in the unincorporated county, there aren't any developments that are being done to modify, in conflict with the current zoning, or in any way to be a modification of the standards. Now, City of Franklin, they do planned unit developments, and so some of the developments that you may be referring to that are higher density may be, in the City of Franklin. The highest density that the county has on the books even is basically 1.2 dwelling units per acre. So there aren't any allowances under our current mechanism for someone to increase that underlying density.
You might talk about the conservation subdivision.
Yeah, okay, that's a good point. So the 1 unit per acre that does cover much of, if not most of, the eastern part of the county is an overall gross density figure. So if you have 100 acres, the most you could hope for is 100 lots. Now, the county does have a couple of different development options. One is a traditional subdivision where each lot is at least an acre in size, and those lots pretty much canvas that 100 acres, and there's very little open space. The alternative to that is what we call a conservation subdivision, where the individual lots can be smaller than an acre in exchange for leaving very large areas of the site as open space, and we require 50% at least of the overall site area to be an open space in those circumstances. So that may be what you're referring to, where there are plenty of cases where the individual lots may be less than an acre, but still the overall density doesn't exceed the 1 unit per acre that zoning requires. We've been making some changes to those conservation subdivision requirements in terms of larger buffers, larger setbacks from adjoining properties and existing roads. I think it's a tool that, if implemented well, does work well because it does preserve more natural resources, more open space. That may be something that you've been referring to.
Okay, then I think I promised here, and then Laura next.
So to jump off of Chad's question, how does this plan take into account the fact that it's on property owners to decide whether they want to annex into cities because of the state statute that changed 2 years ago? How does this plan account for that? Because it's up to neither the city or the county. It's all on property owners,
Right.
not a request an annexation.
No, that's a really good question too, because it's a complicated system. What we would hope would happen as an outgrowth of this plan is that the county and the cities would be able to do some kind of joint strategic planning for those areas. And if decisions are made, for example, about how sewer service or road improvements are going to be funded in those areas, making them more attractive for development, then hopefully the property owners then would want to be annexed. But you're right. I mean, there have been some, as I understand it, some recent changes to state law related to annexation, which kind of creates some hurdles here.
And there's 26 on the Franklin ballot for referendum, and only those property owners can vote. So it's basically useless to even put it on the referendum.
I personally, as a planner, you are a big county with a lot of growth pressures. I would not rule out the possibility that as a county you could petition the state legislature for changes in the future. That could be part of your long-term growth management strategy. It's not unusual for counties in your position to be in a role where you're trying to convince state legislatures to improve the regulations, the laws that apply to you. Okay, Laura, you were next.
Back to conservation subdivisions. Those are really trick subdivisions, you know. Is there any talk amongst y'all regarding 1 acre per buildable acre? You know, you're giving people credit for stuff they can't build on anyway.
Right.
You know, the floodplain, the hillsides and stuff. That's how we have Stevens Valley, which is just a nightmare, you know. So That, I mean, if you're doing, you know, exactly that, then because that's a shapeshifter.
Right, so here's the point that she's making, and the short answer is yes, that's certainly something that this plan could and probably should be looking at. So what's happening in those conservation subdivisions is that land that would not normally be buildable as a conventional single-family 1-acre lot subdivision like Slope is able to be used in the calculations of the gross density. So in effect, people are able to get a higher lot yield under the conservation subdivision than they were able on the conventional subdivision. Did I say that right?
Yeah, you did. Two quick comments on that. One is that these areas that you talk about being unbuildable, most of those are unbuildable only because the county says you can't build on those lands. You know, otherwise people could build on them. It's our zoning that says you can't build on them. Now, having said that, that's absolutely something that we can look at in terms of adding to the requirement that a certain percentage of the open space has to consist of lands that aren't subject to natural resource protection standards. In fact, we're working with the Triune community right now to craft some standards for them based on the recently adopted Triune Special Area Plan, and that's an idea that has been incorporated into the draft standards.
Keep going up front, Dory.
I was just trying to imagine, because of the stats, I know their average is like the size of a lot.
Yeah.
It's going from 18 to maybe 4 or more. I think for some people, and I know when I worked with the committee with county and city of Franklin a long time ago, we came up with the hillside ordinance, we essentially just drove around that tree and just said, we like that, we don't like that. And it made it kind of simplified it. So what does an average of 4 acres really mean? Does it still make it look rural?
Yeah.
That's kind of in the eye of the beholder, I realize that, but.
Right. No, that's a fair question too. and just understand, these acreages, those are just indicators in terms of average parcel size. That accommodates large and small and everything in between. That's not an overall density measurement. But still, it's a fair question. If you are at an average parcel size of 18 acres right now, even under the town and country, you're going to 4. Not as much as you would under business as usual. But, you know, what constitutes rural? I mean, you know, most people would probably agree that when you drive around and you see 1-acre lot subdivisions, that's not rural. Are 5-acre lot subdivisions rural? Well, they're more rural than 1 acre. Yeah, I'm not sure.
I think that's why one thing would be, do we want working farms? Do we want to have certain size
Right.
of land for certain types of uses?
Right, so again, let's be clear here that if we decide, under either of these scenarios, there are still other things that the county can and should be doing, right? To have one of the things that I personally think that this county should be thinking about is a long-term open space preservation strategy, an open space plan that identifies lands that are suitable for preservation, and start thinking about dedicated funding sources to be able to acquire those properties. Certainly conservation easements. The Tennessee Land Trust is very active in this region. And conservation land trusts, thinking about how you can have policies that are more friendly to multiple generational farms, you know, so that essentially people aren't essentially forced economically to have their family lose their farms, so to speak. So there are lots of other things that we can be thinking about here. Like I said, in my caution slide, this is not the plan. These are just kind of thinking about alternative futures. So let's take 1 or 2 more. So if you're really intent, wave your hand hard. So 1, 2, 3, 4. Let's do 4 more questions. So 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay? All right. Yeah, you go.
My question is, with the town and country, did you take into consideration how much can the road system handle? And what I mean by that is, if we're doubling and you everybody sort of knows what the roads are like around Franklin, now all of a sudden you've got 100,000 more people here and there's not more land to build more roads, is it taking account being able to handle that?
Yes, it does, and that's what these cost numbers are taking into account. You have to be careful with the road issue because you can build roads to accommodate any level of growth that you have. It's a question of how much they cost, what impact it has on your community character, what impact it has on your landscape. So it's, but the short version is yes, the roads needs have been baked into this. You probably wouldn't like what you see, but they're in there. Okay? So where was I, second? Back here?
Hello. I may be the minority here because I'm not a Williamson County resident. I'm trying to be. I've lived in Nashville for a long time, worked in the area, and I found myself now with 2 young children, 42 years old, with a changed perspective where I'm looking to go where you created this beacon of light and hope with education and family values. So I've found it increasingly hard to crack the shell of how to do this right, because not only am I trying to build my own home, I'm not a developer, but I've built a lot of restaurants, and now I'm trying to figure out how to build a new type of neighborhood that not only makes everyone here happy, but makes the city happy and makes me and my family happy, and other families. So it's not just a conservation subdivision for the conservation of the land within its borders, but more of conservation of the land within the earth. So it's not just about that hill or that valley, but it's what are you doing with your house? How are you building your house? What kind of sustainability are you doing? I mean, I think there's other conservation methods in green infrastructure that work toward a conservation subdivision that allows you to have a certain density and work with the land. And as far as that goes, I don't know how many other people here have young children. So when we were little, we played outside. And we went outside and we rode our bikes and we got in the creek and we got in the dirt and we played with our friends and we had fun. So if you stretch this thing out to every 5 acres on the unincorporated areas, just hear me out, how does that work? Where's that neighborhood feel? So what that does is it segregates and separates us and our children to their devices. And that kind of scares me, because what I see is, I grew up in the hills of Kentucky, moved here from Nashville, and now I'm regressing back from that city. And it looks like what you're doing is creating another city, and I think a lot of you moved here because you didn't want to live in the city. So I think there is an alternative perspective here, and I'm here to be humble and respectful and listen to you. And the land I'm looking at is actually in District 5, in between Franklin and Nolensville, where you talk about the east. And there's some differentiation I didn't see as far as RD1, rural development, and rural preservation. You kind of lump them both together. Now, do you intend to leave the rural development, which you as a 1, or move them both from 5? Because that was, that would be a huge effect. So some of the areas I'm looking at right now is, of course I've got young kids. I'm not gonna lie. You have fantastic schools, and you've done a great job with them, and I want to be here. I want my kids to be here. I want to learn how you do it. I want to learn what you do, and I want to help. So I want to make my home here. I'm not here because I grew up here, because my job moved me here. I'm here because I'm choosing to want to be here. So I don't know if this is hitting home with anyone, but I think there's other people like me. And I think there's other people that are going to move here like me, that are going to see what you have and see the value and want to be a part of your community. Because in 20 years from now, myself included, we may not be here, but our kids will be. And their kids will be. So are we making this for now because we like the way that hill looks, or we like the way this works, or are we actually looking at it as a big picture of what do we want it to all look like? What do we want to leave behind?
No, I appreciate those comments. I hope that we're all here thinking about what we want it to be like in 20 years and 30 years and 40 years, right, for our children and our grandchildren. A lot of what I hear you say, though, is not inconsistent with the town and country approach, which is where you have the opportunity for lots of different living environments. So it's not just the country, but it's the town or the cities and the suburban. So I appreciate your comments, and I'll just leave them stand with that. Now, I had 2 other here and here. Yes, you snuck in on me, didn't you?
So
Go
the
ahead.
question, the slides, will they be available for us?
Yes.
And then your videotaping, will that be available?
Yes. What's the videotaping mechanism? Is that going to be?
Yeah, so this is for the county's access channel, so it'll be on
Yeah,
the.
we're a Williamson County Television, Channel 3, so it'll be on Channel 3 if you have Comcast, and we go to other, other service providers, and they all have different channels. And did you say when? So it'll be a week or 2 before we get this edited, and so you can watch it there, and you can go to wctv.net to find what your service provider is, or you can pull it up on YouTube, Williamson County Television, just on YouTube, and watch it there in a week or so.
So in addition to that, there is a website that is dedicated to this plan, It's williamson2040.org. And so you can go there and find a lot of information about what's taken place so far. And then within a week or two, we'll have the PowerPoint from tonight up there. We'll have a replication of the exercises that you're going to do so that people who didn't attend tonight's meeting can still participate and comment. And we'll also post the video from tonight.
Okay, so I promised one more person, I think. All right, maybe two. God, you guys are killing me. Go ahead. Go ahead. I know. Go ahead. You can go. And then you.
On the conservation plan, it just seems to me like, when you see a lot of the subdivisions that are being developed in the urban sprawl,
Right.
that the conservation plan plays a part in that because floodplains and right-of-ways, for
Right.
utilities and all of these sort of things, not just hillsides. But there's a lot of land out there that is being used in this conservation plan that is unusable.
Right.
I mean, they could build on them if they wanted to, and as long as that's included in the formula, I think if it wasn't included in the formula, then a lot of urban growth couldn't take place because they couldn't go out and build a step system or
Right.
some alternate system and work in a affordable manner if that wasn't in place.
Right. No, fair comment. And the conservation subdivision regulations can and should continue to be looked at and improved.
I just want to make a couple of statements more than anything. We moved here almost 42 years ago. Our taxes have gone up almost between 500 and 600% since then. Most of that's been in the past 15, 20 years. I read in the news this morning that the Williamson County has the fastest housing prices increase of any place in the country. So there's two ways that's going to hit you, all this growth. Property taxes are going to have to go up, not only for roads, schools, and everything else, but the housing prices increase is going to also speed that up.
Right.
So everybody's going to be hitting every year with prices increases on the taxes. I just don't understand why we even have to have growth out there. I mean, easy way to do it, and there was a thing came up in planning commission a couple of years ago about impact fees. We raised the impact fee 25%, and I guarantee you that'll slow it down.
No, I hear you. I hear you. I have to tell you though, I've been doing this for a long time, and I hear that sentiment a lot. So first of all, using impact fees to stop growth is not legally. I'm not an attorney, but that's not the appropriate use for impact fees. Impact fees are supposed to generate the funds to pay for the improvements from the growth. So really, if the concern here is the amount of growth that you're having, that's why we're giving you a couple of choices here.